As the laughter echoed through Westbrook Mall the Christmas Eve, young patients making pretzels, long-lost brothers sharing a microphone, and a mother's 40-year plan finally complete, everyone understood that some secrets aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to show us how can. The Westbrook Mall was full of Christmas lights and decorations on this snowy morning. The mall smelled like sweet cinnamon and Christmas trees. Shoppers were already coming in to buy their last-minute gifts. Tom Wilson, the old security guard with gray hair, fixed his badge and started walking around the mall like he did every morning. He had worked here for 35 years. As he walked past the big fountain in the middle, he remembered what happened on Christmas Eve in 1983. That was the day he had to throw out a young Eddie Murphy from the mall. Back then, Eddie wasn't famous. He was just a young guy telling jokes near the food court. He made so many people laugh that they blocked the way for other shoppers. The mall boss got angry and told Tom to kick Eddie out forever. Tom felt bad about it, but he needed his job to take care of his family. Now, as he walked past the food court, he saw the mall workers talking excitedly to each other. Sarah from the coffee shop was whispering to Marcus from the electronics store. Even the cleaning people stopped working to look at something near the entrance. Then the front doors opened, and Tom couldn't believe his eyes. There was Eddie Murphy, now older and famous, wearing a black sweater and jeans. He was holding an old piece of paper, the same paper from 1983 that said he was banned from the mall. Eddie walked through the mall like he was looking for someone. Some shoppers saw him and started taking pictures with their phones. But Eddie didn't seem to care. He walked straight to the security office, the same place where Tom had banned him years ago. What Tom didn't know was that Eddie had a newspaper story in his pocket that would change everything. And Eddie wasn't alone. Behind him was someone that made Tom very worried. Someone from the past that would make this Christmas Eve very different from what anyone expected. The morning sun was shining through the mall's glass roof, and Christmas songs were playing softly. This was just the start of a day that would bring up old memories, show hidden secrets, and maybe finally fix something that went wrong 30 years ago. Tom's hands started to shake when he saw who was behind Eddie. It was Mary Chen, the old mall owner's daughter. She used to work at her father's toy store in the mall back in 1983. But that wasn't why Tom was scared. Mary knew something about that Christmas Eve that nobody else knew, not even Eddie. Eddie walked closer to Tom, holding up the old band paper. "Remember this, Officer Wilson?" Eddie asked with a small smile. Some shoppers stopped to watch, making a circle around them. Tom noticed Eddie wasn't angry. He looked more sad than anything else. Mary stepped forward, her gray hair neatly tied back. She was carrying an old photo album. "Tom," she said quietly, "it's time to tell the truth about that night." Tom felt his stomach drop. He looked around at all the people watching them. "Maybe we should go to my office," Tom said quickly. But Eddie shook his head. "No, I think everyone should hear this," Eddie said, pulling out the newspaper story from his pocket. The headline read, "Local Teen's Christmas Wish Saved by Unknown Comedian, 1983. Tom sat down heavily on a nearby bench. He remembered what really happened that day. Eddie hadn't just been telling jokes. He was raising money. There was a sick kid whose family couldn't afford his medicine. Eddie had been doing his comedy show to collect money for them, but that wasn't even the biggest secret. Mary opened her photo album and showed a picture. It was from that Christmas Eve, showing Eddie putting money in a donation box. But in the background, there was something else. Tom's young son, Jimmy, sitting in a wheelchair, laughing at Eddie's jokes. "That's right," Mary said, her voice shaking. Tom's son, Jimmy, was the sick kid Eddie was helping. But Tom didn't know it then. He was just doing what my father told him to do. Kick out the troublemaker. The money Eddie raised that day, she paused, looking at Tom. That money saved Jimmy's life. Eddie stepped closer to Tom. "I knew Jimmy was your son. I saw the family photos on your desk when you were writing up my band notice, but I also saw how much you needed this job, so I never said anything." The crowd of shoppers was completely quiet now, but suddenly someone else stepped through the crowd, a tall young man using a cane. "Hi, Dad," he said to Tom. It was Jimmy, now all grown up. Tom's eyes filled with tears as 30 years of guilt hit him at once. But there was more to this story, much more. Mary was holding something else in her hand, a letter that would reveal an even bigger secret about that Christmas Eve, one that would connect Eddie, Tom, and Mary in a way nobody could have guessed. The Christmas music playing in the mall seemed to fade away as Mary began to unfold the letter, her hands trembling. This morning was about to take another unexpected turn that would shock everyone, especially Eddie Murphy. Mary's hand shook as she opened the old yellow letter, but before she could read it, a loud voice boomed through the mall. "Stop!" Everyone turned to see an old man in a wheelchair. It was Mr. Chen himself, Mary's father, the former mall owner who had ordered Eddie's ban. "I have to speak first," Mr. Chen said, wheeling himself forward. His face looked tired, but determined. "That letter isn't the whole story, Mary. There's something I never told you. Or anyone." Eddie looked confused. He thought he had come to make peace with his past, but now everything was getting more complicated. Mr. Chen pulled out an old VHS tape from his jacket pocket. "This is the mall's security footage from that night," Mr. Chen said. "The real reason I banned Eddie wasn't because of the crowd. It was because of what this tape shows." Tom felt his heart beating faster. He had never seen this tape before. A mall worker quickly brought out an old TV and VCR from the storage room. As everyone watched, the tape showed young Eddie doing his comedy routine. But then the camera turned to show something else. 3 men in suits walking into the mall's back office. One of them looked exactly like a younger Mr. Chen. "Those men," Mr. Chen said quietly, "were trying to force me to sell the mall for almost nothing. They threatened my family. But they didn't know Eddie's comedy show was distracting their lookout man. While everyone was laughing, Mary, who was just a teenager then, sneaked into my office and took pictures of their illegal documents." Mary gasped. "Dad, you never told me that's what those pictures were for. You just told me to take photos of the papers on your desk and run." "I had to ban Eddie," Mr. Chen continued, "because those men said they would hurt him if they found out he helped stop their plan, even by accident. I couldn't let an innocent young man get hurt, so I made myself look like the bad guy." But Eddie started laughing, surprising everyone. "Mr. Chen, you're not going to believe this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Mr. Chen's eyes go wide, a small camera. The twists weren't over yet. This camera would reveal another secret that would connect everyone in an even more surprising way. And somewhere in the mall, someone was watching all of this unfold. Someone who knew the biggest secret of all. "This camera," Eddie said, turning it over in his hands, "belonged to my uncle. He was an undercover FBI agent investigating those same men who threatened you, Mr. Chen." The crowd gasped. Even the Christmas music playing in the mall seemed to pause for a moment. "My comedy routine wasn't just about raising money for Jimmy," Eddie continued. "My uncle asked me to create a distraction so he could plant bugs in their meeting room. I wasn't just some kid telling jokes. I was helping with a federal investigation." Tom sat down heavily on the bench, his mind spinning. "So, when I threw you out," he started. "You almost messed up a year-long FBI operation," Eddie finished. "But something happened that actually helped us even more." He looked at Jimmy, Tom's son, with a knowing smile. Jimmy stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I remember that day clearly," he said. "While everyone was focused on Eddie being kicked out, I saw something from my wheelchair. One of those men dropped a briefcase behind the Christmas tree. I couldn't walk then, but I could wheel myself over. I took some papers out of it and hid them in my blanket." Mary suddenly turned pale. "Jimmy, those papers, did they have red stamps on them?" "Yes," Jimmy nodded. "I gave them to Mary the next day when she came to visit me in the hospital. I thought they were just drawings." Mr. Chen's hands gripped his wheelchair tightly. "Mary, what did you do with those papers?" Before Mary could answer, a new voice spoke up from the back of the crowd. "She gave them to me." Everyone turned to see an elderly woman walking forward, wearing a mall cleaning uniform. She looked familiar to everyone, but no one could quite place her. She took off her cleaning cap, and Mr. Chen nearly fell out of his wheelchair. "Helen?" he whispered. Eddie looked confused. "Who's Helen?" Tom's face went white as he finally recognized her. She was the mall's head of security in 1983. She disappeared right after Christmas that year. We all thought— Helen smiled sadly. "You thought I took a bribe and ran away. But I've been here the whole time, watching, waiting, protecting something that would change everything about that Christmas Eve." She reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out a small red box that made Mr. Chen gasp. The box had a simple label: Christmas Eve, 1983, the real story. But before Helen could open it, the mall's lights suddenly went out, and a deep voice came over the speakers, a voice from the past that would turn this reunion into something no one expected. "Nobody move!" the voice boomed through the dark mall. "That box stays closed." The emergency lights flickered on, casting strange shadows everywhere. The crowd huddled closer together, scared but curious. Helen clutched the red box tightly. "After all these years," she said, "I should have known you'd show up, Robert." She turned toward the security office, where a tall man in his 70s stood at the door, holding an old security badge. "Robert Chen," Mr. Chen said softly. "My own brother." Eddie looked back and forth between the Chen brothers. "Your brother? The plot thickens," he said, trying to lighten the mood. But nobody laughed this time. My dear brother never told anyone he had a twin, Robert said, walking closer. Just like he never told anyone that this mall was actually our father's. And on Christmas Eve 1983, it was supposed to pass to both of us. But something went wrong, didn't it, brother? Mr. Chen lowered his head. I was trying to protect everyone. Protect everyone? Robert laughed. Or protect yourself? That comedy show, the sick kid, the FBI investigation. It was all perfect timing, wasn't it? While everyone was distracted, you changed our father's will. Jimmy wheeled forward suddenly. Wait a minute. I remember something else from that night. He pulled an old candy cane out of his pocket, surprising everyone. I've kept this all these years because there was something inside it. He broke the candy cane open. Inside was a tiny rolled-up piece of paper, perfectly preserved. Helen gasped. That's what I've been protecting all these years. The real will was hidden in the Christmas decorations, but I never knew which one. But as Jimmy started to unroll the paper, Tom noticed something strange. Eddie Murphy was smiling, not his usual smile, but one that suggested he knew something nobody else did. And in the reflection of the mall's dark windows, a shadow moved behind the Christmas tree, where someone else was waiting to reveal the biggest twist of all. As Jimmy carefully unrolled the paper, Eddie stepped forward. Before we read that, he said, I think it's time for one more person to join this family reunion. He turned toward the Christmas tree and called out, You can come out now, Mrs. Chen. From behind the massive Christmas tree stepped an elegant elderly woman in a red coat. Mr. Chen and Robert both froze. Margaret, they whispered together. It was their mother. Everyone thought she had passed away years ago. Hello, my sons, Mrs. Chen said softly. I've been watching my mall for 40 years, disguised as different shoppers, seeing how you both would handle your father's legacy. She walked over to Jimmy and gently took the tiny paper. But this isn't your father's will. It's my letter. The crowd whispered in shock. Helen dropped the red box she was holding, and it popped open, revealing only old Christmas candy. The box was a fake, Helen admitted. I've been helping Mrs. Chen all along. Mom, Robert said, his angry face softening. Why did you let us fight all these years? Mrs. Chen looked at Eddie. Because I needed to see who would put others before themselves. When this young comedian was banned, one of my sons tried to help him secretly, while the other, she looked sadly at Robert, called those men in suits to threaten your brother. But how does Eddie know all this? Tom asked, still confused. Eddie grinned. Remember that FBI uncle I mentioned? He wasn't my uncle. He was working for Mrs. Chen. She hired him to watch over the mall. Last month she found me and told me everything. Today wasn't about the ban at all. It was her test to bring everyone together and find out who really deserved to run the mall. Suddenly Jimmy started laughing. Everyone turned to look at him. Oh, this is too perfect, he said, reaching for something else in his pocket. Because while everyone's been sharing their secrets, he pulled out a shiny new badge. I should probably mention that I'm now the FBI agent in charge of a case that connects to everything that happened here in 1983. The shock on everyone's faces showed that this Christmas Eve still had more surprises to come. And in the food court, a familiar smell of cinnamon started spreading. The same recipe from 1983, cooked by someone who knew the final secret. The smell of cinnamon led everyone to the old pretzel stand. Behind the counter stood a short, smiling man with a familiar face. Mr. Chen gasped. Charlie? The pretzel man from 1983? The very same, Charlie said, bringing out a tray of fresh pretzels. And these aren't just any pretzels. The recipe card hidden inside each one was how Mrs. Chen and I passed messages all these years. He handed a pretzel to Jimmy, including information about your current FBI case. Jimmy broke open his pretzel and found a small memory card inside. The evidence! He exclaimed. The connection between those men in suits from 1983 and the new mall development company trying to buy out family businesses today. They're the same people. Robert's face turned pale. Those developers, they approached me last week. They wanted me to help force my brother to sell the mall. And that's exactly why I had to test you both, Mrs. Chen said firmly. This mall isn't just about business. It's about family, community, and doing what's right. She turned to Eddie. That's what Eddie showed us back in 1983, even though he was just a young comedian trying to help a sick boy. Tom wiped tears from his eyes. All these years, I felt guilty about banning you, he said to Eddie. But you were part of something bigger all along. Speaking of bigger, Eddie smiled, there's one more surprise. He walked over to the pretzel stand and lifted the counter. Underneath was a box filled with old photos. Charlie didn't just make pretzels. He was a photographer who captured everything that happened in the mall, including... He pulled out a photo that made everyone gasp. It was a picture from Christmas Eve 1983 showing young Eddie secretly putting an envelope of money in Tom's coat pocket while being escorted out. Enough money for Jimmy's entire treatment. But in the background of the photo was something even more shocking, something that would change the entire story again. Just then, the mall's power fully returned, Christmas music filled the air, and on the photo's back, writing appeared. Invisible ink, only visible in proper light. As Jimmy read it aloud, no one was prepared for what they were about to learn. Section 8, Property of the Chen Family Time Capsule, Jimmy read from the back of the photo. To be opened Christmas Eve 2024. He turned the photo over, and behind young Eddie and Tom, there was a wall safe visible in the background, the same wall safe that was still in the security office. Today's date, Helen whispered. After 40 years, it's time. Everyone moved to the security office. Tom's hands shook as he opened the safe he'd walked past every day for decades. Inside was a single manila envelope and a DVD marked Play Me First. They gathered around a screen in the security room. The DVD showed Mr. Chen and Robert's father, old Mr. Chen, recording a message 1 week before he died in 1983. My dear family, the old man began, if you're watching this, you've all finally come together. The mall was never meant to divide you. The real test wasn't about who would own it. It was about who could bring it together. He held up a business plan. Inside the envelope, you'll find my real gift. I turned the mall into a community trust. Nobody owns it. It belongs to everyone. The profits go to helping sick children, like young Jimmy was. Robert sank into a chair. All these years fighting over ownership. But wait, Eddie interrupted. The envelope's empty. Charlie, the pretzel man, started laughing. Check under the pretzel stand again, he said. The real papers were never in the safe. Jimmy wheeled back to the stand and found a hidden compartment. Inside were the trust documents and something else, adoption papers from 1983. As he read them, his face went white. What is it? Tom asked his son. Dad, Jimmy said slowly, according to this, I'm not the only one who was adopted in 1983. He looked directly at Eddie Murphy. You were too, and our birth mother. He pointed at Mrs. Chen, who had tears in her eyes. Hello, my sons, she said softly. Now you know why I had to make sure you both turned out right. The mall fell completely silent, but this revelation was about to trigger an even more surprising chain of events that would make this Christmas Eve unforgettable. Before anyone could react to this shocking news, Charlie quickly pulled another pretzel from his stand. There's more, he said, breaking it open. Inside was an old key with Chinese writing on it. That's Father's shipping company key, Robert and Mr. Chen said together. Mrs. Chen nodded. The mall wasn't your father's only legacy. The shipping company that disappeared in 1983. Disappeared? Eddie interrupted. Or went underground? He pulled out his phone and showed everyone a news article. Mystery company sets up free medical transport for sick children, operating since 1983. Jimmy wheeled closer to the screen. So, that's how I got free transport to my treatments all those years. And why my FBI investigation kept hitting dead ends when tracking the company. It was protected by family all along? Tom suddenly remembered something. The night I banned Eddie, a mysterious truck pulled up behind the mall. I always wondered, that was the first medical transport, Mrs. Chen explained. While everyone was focused on the ban, we were loading sick children into comfortable buses, disguised as delivery trucks. Your father started a secret network that's helped thousands of kids. But Charlie wasn't done. He pulled out one last pretzel. This one's special, he said, handing it to Eddie. Inside was a small brass button. Eddie stared at it, his hands shaking. This button, it was from my birth father's uniform. He was a bus driver who died helping kids escape a school fire. He looked at Mrs. Chen. You kept it all these years? To remind me of the man who saved my life in that fire, she said quietly. That's why I knew his son, you, Eddie, would have the same heart for helping others. Just then, Jimmy's FBI phone beeped. What appeared on his screen would lead to the final, most unexpected twist of all. One that would bring everything full circle and reveal why this Christmas Eve reunion had to happen exactly 40 years later. Jimmy looked at his phone and started laughing. You won't believe this, he said. The FBI just approved Operation Safe Haven, converting old malls across the country into medical transport hubs for sick children. And guess which mall they want as the pilot location? Westbrook Mall, everyone said together. Mrs. Chen smiled. That's why today had to be the day. The trust documents needed all the Chen family signatures, including both my sons. She looked at Eddie and Jimmy, the biological and the adopted one. Tom stood up straighter. So when I banned Eddie that night, You actually helped protect the whole operation, Eddie finished. The band kept attention on me instead of the medical transport starting up in the back. You did the right thing, Tom. Charlie brought out one final box of pretzels. These aren't just for us, he said. Every Christmas Eve since 1983, I've been teaching sick kids in the hospital how to make these. Check the security cameras. On the screens, they saw the mall's entrance, where buses were pulling up. Children with medical badges started coming in, all wearing pretzel maker aprons. Leading them was a familiar face, the first child who'd received transport help in 1983. My daughter, Helen said proudly. She's now the head of pediatric transport at the hospital. As the children filled the mall, Eddie pulled out his wallet. Inside was the original band notice, now faded. He handed it to Tom. Would you do the honors? Tom tore up the band notice as everyone cheered. Mrs. Chen looked at her whole family, biological, adopted, and chosen, and said, the real secret of the mall was never about property or money. It was about building a family that would keep helping others. The children gathered around Charlie's pretzel stand, learning to make the same recipe that had carried secret messages of hope for 40 years. Above them, the Christmas lights seemed to shine a little brighter. Eddie looked at his newfound brother Jimmy and smiled. You know what? I think it's time for another comedy show. But this time, he handed Jimmy a microphone. How about we do it together? As laughter and the smell of cinnamon filled the mall once again, Tom realized that sometimes the best security isn't about keeping people out. It's about knowing when to let them in. Christmas music played softly as the story came full circle, proving that some malls hold more than just shops and food courts. They hold the secrets of families, the spirit of giving, and the magic of Christmas that spans generations.